Hey everyone, welcome back to my sewing and DIY channel. In this video today, I'm going to show you how to make this super adorable one-of-a-kind fish purse. This fish purse is inspired by all the vintage fish-shaped novelty wicker purses of my dreams, and I simply wanted to recreate one using skills that I know and materials that I have access to, and here we are. The pattern is now available via the first link in the description box below, and you can get 20% off your purchase with the code ICU. Now let's get straight into the tutorial. To sew this fish purse, you'll need half a yard of main fabric for the outside of the purse and half a yard of lining fabric for the inside of the purse. For the main fabric, sturdy fabrics like denim, twill, and canvas will work very well. As part of the design, you'll also need 3 yards of 7/8 inch wide single fold bias tape, a set of magnetic snap button as closure for the purse, and 2 flat buttons for the eyes. The key material for giving structure to the purse is the Sew-In Ultra Firm Stabilizer. It has to be the sew-in version. Don't get the kind with adhesives because that will not work with the way this purse is constructed. For my purse, I used the 70 Peltex Sew-In Ultra Firm Stabilizer by Pellon, but there are also other alternatives available. You'll also need to use some sew-through Ridgeline boning. For successful sewing with the least amount of frustrations, you need to get the right needle for the fabric you're using. I recommend using sharp size 16 needles. And for sewing the bias tape, I also like to use a zipper presser foot. And you'll see how I use it for sewing once we get to that step in the sewing process. Now it's time to put the pattern pages together. As always, make sure you print the pattern at 100% scale. Double check your scale with the test square and piece the pages together by lining up the flowers and the pattern lines. This is how the pattern looks with all 4 pages together. Now when cutting the pattern piece out, for this design, I actually like to cut out the outline of the darts, the handle, and the notches because this actually makes it easier for me to mark those points out on my fabric later, and you'll see exactly how I do that in the next minute. Cut 2 pieces with the main fabric with both pieces mirrored, and do the same with the lining and the stabilizer. Make sure you also transfer all the markings and clip the notches. I like to use different methods of marking with the different materials. I used a ballpoint pen with the stabilizer, tracing wheel and transfer paper for the twill, and a pencil for the outdoor fabric. Now here's how all the pieces look cut and marked. Before we start putting the purse together, you should add any decorative stitches you want to the main fabric pieces. So in my earlier prototypes, I actually added embroidered details to my purse, and if that's something you think you want to do as well, do it right here, right now. We're going to start off by preparing the lining fabric for sewing. Apply a scrap piece of interfacing of about 1 by 2 inches big over where the magnetic snap button is supposed to go on the wrong side of the lining fabric. Your magnetic snap button set should come with a little plate like this. Take that plate and put it over where the button is supposed to go and mark out the holes for cutting and fitting the prongs of the button. I'm doing this on the right side of the lining since the marking is now covered by the interfacing on the wrong side of the fabric. Cut the holes out and make sure the prongs fit, but do not install the buttons at this stage. Next, sew the darts for all the pieces of the fabric and the stabilizer. As usual, start from the widest point of the dart, work your way towards the tip and tie a knot at the end to secure your stitches. It's kind of hard to pin the stabilizer in place with sewing pins. So over here, I'm just pressing it down in place with my fingers before sewing. These darts create a nice rounded shape for the fish purse. So there's kind of like a round belly, a little bit of more of a 3D effect. It helps us to be able to put a little bit more things in the purse without any awkward bulging. And when you're done, use a pair of sharp scissors to trim off the dart in the stabilizer. It might seem like a minor step because it's such a small amount, but trust me, it makes a difference. Over here, I'm also pressing the darts in the main and lining fabric pieces in opposite directions so the darts won't end up stacking together when we put the layers of fabric together. Place the wrong side of the main fabric with the right side of the stabilizer. Match them at the notches and sew them together with straight stitches about an 1/8 inch from the raw edge. If you need to trim off any excess stabilizer, do not trim the fabric. Because we're humans and we can't cut the same way twice, it is likely that the main fabric won't line up perfectly with the stabilizer. The important part of this step is to make sure the darts and the notches line up and that the fabric actually wrap over the stabilizer snugly. Now things are starting to get a little bit more interesting. We're going to put the main and lining pieces right sides together. You can choose to pin or clip them together in place, again making sure they match up at the darts and the notches, then sew along the handle outline. Because the ends of the handle outline is a curve, you want to go slow, take your time, and pivot your work as you need to. Next, use your sharpest fabric scissors and carefully cut out the hole for the handle of the purse. Leave about a 1/4 inch as seam allowance for the fabric. When cutting, I find it helpful to start by cutting a straight slit right across and then trim the top and bottom halves of the fabric pieces. Now what about the stabilizer? You need to trim the stabilizer as close to the stitch line as possible without actually cutting the stitches. When trimming the stabilizer, I like to work with the stabilizer facing up, one hand holding on to the stabilizer and the other hand holding the scissors at an angle, almost laying flat on the stabilizer. I find that this method of cutting really helps to shave off the stabilizer at an angle and remove the unnecessary bulk along the handle outline. Make sure you also clip the fabric around the curved ends so the curved outline will turn out nice and smooth when we turn the lining right side out. Next, take the lining and turn it through the handle hole so that the right side of the main and lining fabric pieces are facing out. The stabilizer should be sandwiched between the fabric pieces, and if you see any puckering in the corners of the handle opening, it's probably because the fabric in the seam isn't trimmed close to the stitches enough. After that, understitch the lining along the handle opening with the seam allowance folded towards the lining fabric. Next, edge stitch along the handle opening. I like to pin the lining fabric in place beforehand to make sure the lining fabric really sits nice and flat on the underside. And when sewing, I have the main fabric facing up at the machine. Over here, it's really important that you roll the lining fabric under as you go so that the lining fabric doesn't peek out from the inside of the purse. Pinning beforehand helps, but it's still not foolproof, so I usually take pauses in between sewing and adjust my fabric as I go. And when you're done, this is how the handle opening should look. It's time to install the magnetic button. You should already have the holes for the prongs cut from the beginning, and now all you have to do is insert the prongs through the right side. place the flat plate on the wrong side and fold the prongs towards each other. Depending on the quality of your magnetic button, you may or may not have this little gap between the plate and the fabric. In my experience, this makes the button a little unstable during use, and to overcome this issue, I usually use a little piece of fleece and put that between the flat plate and the fabric to support and stabilize the button. Now that looks a lot better. And when you're done with that, hand sew the button eyes in place. We're getting close to finishing, let's keep going. Baste the main and lining layers together along the outline of the fish, 1/8 inch from the edge. We're going to finish the raw edge of each half of the fish purse with bias binding. And here's how we're gonna do it. Start off by attaching the zipper presser foot on your sewing machine. Next, place the right side of the bias binding with the main fabric, lining them up along the raw edge. I don't like to pin the entire length of the bias binding along the raw edge for this design because I usually have to do a lot of adjustment to help the bias binding sit nicely along the curves as I'm working with the sewing machine. Before you begin your first stitch, leave about 2 inches of bias binding. Backstitch at the beginning, then start sewing. When sewing, make sure your stitches are going on the original fold of the bias binding. You'll notice that I have the raw edge facing the right side of the presser foot and the presser foot set up so I have the needle to the right of the foot. This setup is important because it gives me room to clip the bias binding as I sew along the curves. So the trickiest part of this step is making sure the bias binding doesn't pucker when sewing along the curves of the fishtail, and to do that, I clip the bias binding and pivot my work as I go along. Sometimes along the curves, I find that I'm literally making 1 to 2 stitches each time before I pivot and adjust my work again. And like I mentioned, I always leave the needle in my work before releasing the presser foot and pivoting my work. These are the points along the edge of the fish purse where you'll have to clip the bias binding for it to fit along the curves. Do this slowly and carefully until you're about 1 inch away from the first stitch. Cut and leave about 2 inches of bias binding here. Join the bias binding together by folding the fish body and sewing the bias tape so that the stitches sit right next to the fish body. You might have to adjust your presser foot and the alignment of your needle for the stitches to be as close to the fish body as possible. When you've done this right, you should have the bias tape sitting nice and flat against the fabric once you unfold the fish body. Stitch the gap between the first and the last stitch so the entire length of the bias tape is stitched along the edge of the fish body. Next, we're going to press the bias binding away from the main fabric and fold it over the raw edge to the lining side so the raw edge is completely encased in the bias binding. And because we're imperfect humans, it's not likely that we have sewn the bias tape with 100% precision. So over here, you might find that you need to trim some of the fabric or stabilizer for the bias binding to encase the raw edge evenly. Now we're going to start stitching the bias binding in place. You can do this by stitching in the ditch or edge stitching. Over here, I chose to use the technique of stitching in the ditch, which is sewing right inside the seam between the bias binding and the main fabric. And the stitches should catch the bias binding on the underside of your work. Start and end your sewing next to one of the ends of the handle opening and leave a gap of about 1/2 inch for inserting the Ridgelin boning. Cut 5 inches of boning and trim the boning lengthwise so you'll get just 3 strands of the boning material. I'm using the 1/4 inch wide boning here, which comes with 4 strands of plastic, but I find that just a little bit too stiff and it doesn't give enough flexibility for the curve of the handle. So 3 strands is kind of like the sweet spot for this design. Insert the Ridgeline boning material into the bias binding through the opening. Make sure it's positioned right above the handle opening, then stitch that opening closed. Finally, we're going to stitch both halves of the fish purse together. Before that, we need to baste the 2 halves of the fish purse together, making sure that they're nicely lined up along the finished edge. You can definitely just clip them together and send it to the sewing machine, but personally, I find that basting definitely provides more accuracy. I also like to stuff the fish purse with some soft material like this bag of fleece scraps so that the finished edge actually line up better when I'm sewing the 2 halves together. And definitely don't be afraid to use extra clips on top of basting as needed. Now we're going to sew the 2 halves together with the regular presser foot. And we're going to leave the section between the notches along the handle opening unstitched. We're going to start at this point here and work our way around the fish and end right here. These 2 points are going to be big stress points when using the purse, so use a triangular stitch pattern so the stitches are less likely to unravel and break with time. And you're done! Congratulations, you just finished sewing a super adorable one-of-a-kind fish purse. If you have learned a thing or two in this video tutorial, do me a favor and give this video a thumbs up. I hope you'll enjoy sewing and using this fish purse. If you're curious about how the design of the fish purse evolved from the first prototype to this final version, then do check out the short videos that I posted on this channel earlier. Don't forget to subscribe for more sewing and DIY, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!